welcome back. So this lecture is on the Islamic Caliphates. Like the previous one on the Byzantine Empire, it's relatively short compared to some of the other lectures. So uh, enjoy it while you can. The next one on the Mongols is actually going to be pretty long. So uh, in fact, the Burbank and Cooper book combines the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphates sort of into the same chapter, uh, being that they're both monotheistic empires. Byzantine Empire was Christian, Islamic Caliphates are Islamic, um, but and they were around. They overlapped and even fought each other, but they're also like pretty different. So I thought it was worth it to give a lecture, even if that meant that each lecture was. So we'll get into it, and yeah, it'll hopefully it won't be too long and too painful. So we've seen a number of different approaches to religion over the lifetime of the different empires, and particularly the Roman Empire. It started as polytheistic and so kind of inherently tolerant, right? There are many gods, and if you conquer someone and they have a new god, well, bring them into the pantheon. We'll worship them too. There was really uh, relatively little conflict over that sort of thing. Um, Actually, the conflict would be with people like Jews or Christians early on who were monotheists. That was actually a problem, more of a problem for the polytheists than if you had new and different gods. Um, but then we saw Rome, right, transition into a completely monotheistic Christian state. So that's I just misspelled Christian. Um, Pretty huge change. The Islamic caliphates they grew up around the borders of the Roman Empire, so the Roman Empire was still around, or at least the Byzantine version of it. Their peoples would have been very familiar with the Romans, would have traded with the Romans, right, for a long time. Uh, but in there, the idea, right, was always the idea of expanding the territory of the Islamic State. Like, interesting about the Islamic caliphates is they are from the beginning religious empires, right? They're at their core is religion, monotheism, and the legal system and the very fact of their expansion is all tied up in the theology. So it's an interesting in right an empire for which religion is not just some one of many things, or maybe they're kind of mostly interested in trade, and religion is another thing. Religion is the central thing for these Islamic. So Islam began in the city of Mecca, which was a center of trade. So it's located in what's now Saudi Arabia, uh, and it's a dry area, right? So it was lots of nomadic people. The land couldn't sustain much agriculture, so you had people trading, but you had to keep moving, finding water. You couldn't settle down and grow crops. So it was a center of trade. It was also a religious center even before Islam for the various polytheistic religions that were around, and couldn't support a large population, right? So it became the center of the Islamic Empire, but a different sort of empire, right? It wasn't going to become a city as large as Rome or as Byzant or as Constantinople. It wasn't support that large population. And so what you end up with a different approach to empire with the Islamic Empire. Not so concerned with geography or their capital, right, or maintaining this particular territory. Instead, a very mobile population, and as long as the religion was kept, that was what bound people together, less than geography. So Muhammad is the founder of Islam, lived from 570 BCE to 632 CE. Claimed that he spoke with God, which was a not an uncommon thing in that time. Remember, uh, monotheism was not the norm, right? In that area, there were many gods, and many people, right, spoke to their gods. But what made Muhammad different is that he claimed he spoke with the only God, right? There was only one God, and Muhammad was in conversation with him. This was Allah, right? The supreme God. So this is the God to which Muhammad spoke. which was identified with the God of the Bible, so the God of the Jews and the Christians. Uh, and the Muslims tied themselves into the history of the Bible and traced their ancestry back to some of the people in the Bible. So the Muslims, they call themselves those who submit to God, and a religion, right, and a group of believers began to grow up around Muhammad. They were fairly early on driven out of Mecca by the local polytheists. Polytheists can get along with almost anybody except a monotheist, right? Um, they're happy to take your God on board, but if you're telling them that their gods are not real gods, they're going to get upset with you. So that's what happened to Muhammad and his early followers. So they fled to Medina, another city in the area, and this flight sort of group to cohere. So they became a distinct religious community and calling themselves the Ummah. So from the beginning, right, Islam was religious and political. They sought unity between the state and religion. There are five pillars of Islam, which are the core of faith: belief in a single God and Muhammad as his prophet, prayer 5 times a day, fasting during the month of Ramadan, giving alms to the poor, and making a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in your life. Politically, they divide the entire world into two parts. There is Dar al-Islam, which is the world of peace, right? The world that God, that Islam, and there is Dar al-Harb, and again, excuse my pronunciation, I do my best, but I'm not an Islamic scholar and I do not speak the language. Um, but this is, right, so again, there's the world of peace, right, the world of Islam, and there's the world of war, the rest of the world. Calling it the world of war is significant. It means you are at war with not practice Islam, and they should be converted um, by war, right? There's also a body of law that developed called Sharia, and again, this unifies religious, legal, and political life. It's all one package, right? And as we said, that's what makes this empire distinct. So there was something attractive about the religion early on. The local tribes um, began to convert Islam, and it spread quickly, which led to sort of larger and larger tribal armies that would then acquire territory by force. So an early target for this group, militant group of this new religion, was the Syrian part of the Byzantine Empire, which was becoming that part of the empire had been at war with the Persian Empire. Um, Weakened by it, became a good target for right these Islamic this Islamic nascent Islamic state to acquire territory. So by 636, the Byzantines retreated from Syria. So they had acquired this wasn't yet called the Caliphate, right? But this new Islamic State had taken over that territory. Um, then they moved on the Persians. Then they moved on Egypt, Western Persia. Uh, they didn't conquer Constantinople. Again, Constantinople, eminently defensible, right? Stuck around for a long, long time. But they got as far as Spain in the west, India in the east. So, spread quite far and wide. On this map, the green spot is just the beginning, but it spread as far as Spain, which is all the way in the far left of that map, then as far as India, which is barely visible on the far right, so all through North Africa. So uh, became quite large, right? I think this was supposed to be to give you the spread, but I guess it's not working. So the Islamic empires, for being as religious as they were, and even though religion was tied up in everything about the empire, they were fairly tolerant of non-Islamic people within their empire. You weren't required to convert to Islam if your uh, territory was conquered, but you were taxed at a higher rate if you didn't convert. So there were certain advantages to converting to Islam. If you were a loyal, uh, right practicer of the faith, you were encouraged to settle into the cities, right, of the new areas that were conquered rather than in the countryside and try to farm. Idea being to sort of foster Islamic culture in the cities of the new territories, and also to be there as a military force if they were needed. So the net effect was to make conversion, and so your lifestyle was sort of paid for, right? So if you settled in the cities, right, and you couldn't farm, right, but you were willing to serve in the military, um, that was you were sort of what's the word? Funded, right, by the empire. Um, so conversion to Islam became rather attractive, right? And many locals, even if they didn't convert, would trade, right, with the Islamic peoples, and we've seen this sort of approach over and over, right? One of the ways to keep an empire large is to make it worth people's while to want to join, interact, to trade with you. Right? You can make a buck for everybody involved, then people will be part of the Islamic Empire. Most people are not uh, super patriotic in that way, right? So Muhammad died in 632, and there was the question of succession. So he didn't have any sons, right? He had some daughters. So there was a question of who would take up as leader of the religion and of the state. Um, his father-in-law ended up being the next in line, Abu Bakr. Muhammad had several wives. So it was one of his fathers. They called him Caliph, which just meant the successor, right? The successor of Muhammad. But the name sort of stuck to future rulers. The state became called a caliphate. So now we have Islamic caliphates. That's the name of these. Caliphate would be like a dynasty or something in China, right? So by the third caliphate, uh, there were still arguments over who was the legitimate successor. Um, as we've seen before, right? Assassinations, that's kind of typical of empires when there's worries about succession or something to be gained, right? By questions about succession, civil wars, until this one's a tough one to pronounce. Muawiyah managed to lock down a relatively stable reign for a while, and this was the beginning of the Umayyad Caliphate, which is the first notable one where we have sort of stable, long reign. But there was a rivalry. So Ali, who was a previous caliphate who was assassinated, some people who were still loyal to Ali formed a rival faction called the Shiites, right? That name may be familiar to you. Shiite Islam is still around today, often in the news. They're still the minority sect, but they are in some ways, the most militant, right? Um, so it was distinct. For an outsider, it's hard to sometimes see the difference. They agree, Shiites and the rest of Islam, who are called Sunni, and the Umayyad Caliphate was a Sunni state. The differences between the two can be difficult to see from the outsider. They believe in the five pillars, um, and they disagree vehemently over the question of succession, right, and who's the rightful leader of the Islamic State. And there are some differences. Shiites tend to favor sort of they latch onto particular personalities, particular leaders. Sunni tends to be more interested in textual, right, the interpretation of the Quran and so on. Um, but it's been largely the dispute has just been sort of political or who is the proper leader, right? So the Umayyads remained dominant despite the emergence of this important, right, Shiites. And so they maintained their territory all the way up to Spain and as long as 1492. Um, but one sort of bone of contention the Shiites had with them is the caliphate, as it grew and became rich and became a large empire, started to look a little worldly and a little less religious, right? So slavery was adopted, other sorts of more hierarchical, early on is Islam was fairly egalitarian, right? And everyone was more or less equal. As the empire starts to get rich, there starts to be social stratification, um, and so they were accused by the Shiites of, failing to live up to the real religious principles and becoming too worldly. So we have the Umayyads, we have the Shiites. Early on, the Shiites supported another rival faction um, that grew quite large, took over large areas of modern Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan, which are called the Abbasids. So this was established around 750 CE, after they beat the Umayyads in Damascus and drove them out. So early on, there was some Shiite involvement, right, in the emergence of the Abbasids. The Abbasids and so stayed in the Sunni majority, but were a distinct faction from the Umayyads, right? So that dynasty lasted into the 13th century, right, the 1200s, and its capital was at Baghdad. Uh, and even then, there was more, right, factions and more splintering. So several Shiite areas broke off and began to govern themselves, like the Fatimids in Egypt. So the empire, right, reached the Umayyads were sort of victims of their own success and got so large that they began to splinter. So a sort of distinct political structure grew up around this empire. As it grew large, you have to figure out ways to govern, right? So territories were divided into provinces, each with their own governors. We see this in every empire we've studied so far. There were courts, right, which tried cases, and again, according to Sharia law, which was religious, as well as sort of legal stuff. Of course, taxes were collected, which paid for soldiers and officials to enforce the law and to govern all these territories. They would often, so within sort of the inner circle of the Ummah, right? Uh, there, as we saw, all this rivalry and argument over succession. So often, when they wanted to bring in officials to sort of govern the empire, they were brought in from the outside, right, rather than put a member of a rival faction and give them too much power. Uh, Often they would take slaves from a conquered territory at a young age, bring them, take them away from their homes, right, bring them to uh, the center of the empire, bring them up within the court, right, in the palace with all the officials, and train them to be high officials. They're called mawali. Right? Um, some offices were held by eunuchs. We talked about eunuchs when we talked about the Byzantine Empire, and they actually borrowed this from Islamic caliphates. So eunuchs are castrated, right, and have children for that reason. And so again, the assumption was, well, they have no interest in power. Since can't have children and can't set up a dynasty of their own, they're not going to be assassinating people and trying to um, whether that's actually the case is debatable. Right? But at any rate, that was the idea. So the caliphate depended largely on paid soldiers. These were typically people from outside the empire, Persians, Kurds, Turks. So many of these people were horse-mounted warriors, quite good, right? Soldiers of fortune, right? This is their career, uh, quite good at it, and they would hire them again based on ability, not on nobility. This is another theme we've seen over and over, right? When an empire, when someone comes to prominence, and often it's an emperor like in the Qin, you almost see with Genghis Khan, the Mongols, right? They come to power, and the first thing they want to do is consolidate their power. That means they want to break up the old systems of power and create a new system where people can rise to the top based on ability, some sort of meritocratic system. At any rate, with the military, this was the case in Islamic Caliphate. They hired soldiers, and if you're a good soldier, you got paid well. Um, and this allowed for upward mobility, and it made for a quite good army as well. In fact, powerful aristocratic families were kind of noticeably absent from Islamic politics. The the position of the vizier is a particularly sort of Islamic thing. So this was almost like a second in command, or it's just at least an important advisor, sort of a confidant of the caliph, right? So he would always be around with the caliph. The caliph would be consulting with the vizier. But like the other officials, the vizier was typically a foreigner, right? Not someone from within the inner circle that was very contentious and might be competing for power. So the histories of the Islamic Empire often spend a lot of time in this on this relationship between the caliph and his vizier, and it seems to be a particularly close relationship, even sort of emotionally close, right? There's a lot of trust there and love, but then also sort of fraught, right? Because there was always fear of betrayal, and maybe this is the case, with anyone with great power. Uh, but it's also possible that these histories are, right, describing these relationships in such great detail and spending so much time on them as a sort of moral fable, which the idea is don't trust these outsiders too much, right? They can betray you. So try to, in the end, only keep with religion and keep with the. So, the dependence on a foreign military that's only there because they're being paid, and also on all your officials, right, being from outside the empire and not even necessarily being uh, believers in Islam, is a risky strategy, right? If you're As soon as the soldiers feel like they're not being paid well enough, or they can find someone to pay them better, right, they're going to be gone. And so in 869, some Turkish soldiers decided they weren't happy and killed the caliph and installed their own vizier, right? So that's a worry with these, again, foreign soldiers for hire. There was constant faction, right? Arguments and factions, and other Muslim factions would take territory from time to time. So the Fatimids took over Egypt, the Shiites took Iraq at one point. There were also incursions from foreign enemies. So the Seljuk Turks conquered Baghdad, 1055. Abbasid Caliphate finally fell in 1258 to the Mongol Empire. And the next lecture is going to be on the Mongol Empire that was at one point the largest empire, right? There's a picture of it. Enormous, right? Sort of short-lived, right? But huge and pushed into Islamic areas, as well as taking over all of China. A Kurdish force, right, took the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, and eventually the Ottoman Empire took over the whole area. Right? And the Ottoman Empire was in modern times. So that's sort of a quick overview, right, of the trajectory of these Islamic um, empire, right, starting around the 600s and lasting into the 1200s. So we've talked a lot about military expansion, political organization, and the fact that this was an inherently religious empire. But that doesn't mean that day-to-day life in the Islamic world was that bizarre. And this is the last slide, but I bring it up because even in our current political situation, right, when people talk about Islam, and talk in terms of like wars and terror, and it may seem like a very foreign and very, very sort of place, but I mean, life in an Islamic empire at the time was much like it would have been in many of the other advanced civilizations at the time. So we mentioned, religious diversity was tolerated. So you didn't have to, right? It wasn't like sort of Islamic fascism or something like that. You could have your own religion and trade and live within the territory of the Islamic Empire and, in fact, thrive, right? Um, Philosophy actually flourished in these Islamic caliphates. So Ibn Sina, who's sometimes called Avicenna, uh, he was an Aristotelian, right? So Islamic scholars actually preserved much of Greek philosophy. So when what we have now of like the writings of Aristotle that were rediscovered in Europe in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance were preserved through the Islamic scholars, and many of them are sort of translated right from Arabic. So without the Islamic empires, we may well have lost much of our ancient Greek philosophy. So they were important in saving a lot of the knowledge, a lot of the scholarship from the ancient world and transmitting it to the later medieval and Renaissance area European world. Uh, and I mean, you just have to look at Islamic mosque uh, to know that, right, they cared about beauty, right? They cared about pleasure, uh, as well as, right, religion, right? So it's a unified religious and political state, but it's not like, doesn't mean that it's here or incredibly unpleasant to live under, right? They are human beings. They love science and they love beauty. So I just wanted to point that out in the last slide because, they are interesting because of their religious focus, right? But in many ways, they're just like any other. So again, yeah, pretty short, kept under 30 minutes. Brace yourselves for the one of the Mongols to be a little longer, but very interesting, right? Group, the Mongols. So I think hopefully you will enjoy it, and I'll see them